The mountain doesn't give up its secrets easily. The approach to Castello della Pietra, perched in the steep Ligurian hills of northwestern Italy, demands something from the visitor: effort, patience, a willingness to climb. And that, as it turns out, was always the point. The castle rises from a narrow ridge of rock in the Val Trebbia, southeast of Genoa, at an elevation that feels borrowed from the clouds. Two towers, one square, one round, anchor either end of what remains of its walls, and between them, centuries of weather and neglect have reduced much of the structure to rubble. But what survives is enough. Enough to read the intentions of the men who built it, and to understand why they chose this particular piece of sky. The Val Trebbia has been a corridor of movement since Roman times. The river below cuts through the Apennines, linking the Ligurian coast to the Po Valley, and whoever controlled the heights above it controlled that passage. When Castello della Pietra was constructed, most likely during the 12th or 13th century, though the precise date is still debated, it was built to do exactly that: to watch, to warn, to stop, if necessary, anyone moving through the valley who hadn't been invited. The castle is most closely associated with the Fieschi family, one of the most powerful noble dynasties in medieval Liguria. The Fieschi produced two popes, Innocent IV and Adrian V, and maintained a web of fortified holdings across the region. Castello della Pietra appears in historical records under their control by the 14th century, and there is reasonable evidence to suggest they may have commissioned expansions to the original structure. For a family whose influence stretched from the papacy to the Genoese Republic, a mountain fortress in a strategic valley wasn't a vanity project. It was a piece on a much larger board. The site's military logic is immediately clear to anyone willing to look. The ridge on which the castle sits is barely wide enough to accommodate the buildings themselves. On either side, the terrain drops sharply, sheer in places, densely forested in others. There is no approach that does not expose an attacker. A small garrison here could hold off a far larger force, and the towers provided unobstructed sightlines down both directions of the valley. Signal fires lit from these heights could reach Genoa before a threat arrived at the city's gates. Historians have also pointed to the castle's role as a toll point. The Val Trebbia route was used by merchants, pilgrims, and armies alike, and noble families routinely extracted fees from travelers passing through their territory. A fortified position above the road wasn't just a defensive asset, it was a revenue stream. The two functions reinforced each other. The castle's military reputation made the toll easier to collect, and the income from the toll helped maintain the garrison. What makes Castello della Pietra particularly interesting is how its story intersects with the broader arc of medieval Ligurian politics. Genoa, the dominant power on the coast, was in near constant tension with the noble families of its hinterland. The Fieschi, for all their papal connections, were not always on good terms with the Republic. The castle changed hands multiple times over the centuries, through inheritance, purchase, and conflict, eventually passing out of noble control altogether as the power of the old feudal families declined. By the 16th century, the castle had lost most of its strategic relevance. Gunpowder had changed the calculus of fortification, rendering medieval walls less useful and mountain redoubts less impregnable. The Val Trebbia was no longer the contested corridor it had once been. The garrison withdrew, the Fieschi faded, and the mountains slowly began to reclaim what had been built upon it. What remains today has been partially restored, and the site is accessible to visitors who make the climb. The two towers still stand against the ridgeline, worn but recognizable. The masonry shows the layering of different building campaigns, older stonework visible beneath later additions, a record of the castle's long evolution written in the walls themselves. Archaeologists and architectural historians have noted the unusual integration of the natural rock into the castle's foundations. In several places, the builders simply used the living rock as part of the structure, carving into it where necessary and building up from it where they could. It's a technique born of necessity, but it also produced something that feels almost organic, as though the castle grew from the mountain rather than being placed upon it. That relationship between human ambition and natural landscape is, in many ways, the defining quality of Castello della Pietra. The men who built it did not choose this site despite its difficulty. They chose it because of it. The Atlantic winds off the Cantabrian coast carry a particular kind of cold. Not the sharp freeze of the high mountains, but something slower and more persistent, the kind that settles into stone and stays there. On a promontory above the Navia River in the Asturias region of northwestern Spain, that wind moves through the ruins of a settlement that was old before Rome arrived and that endured long after Rome had shaped nearly everything around it. Castro de Coaña is a hill fort. The term doesn't quite do it justice, but it's the most useful starting point. The site belongs to a category of settlement found across Atlantic Europe, from Ireland and Scotland down through Wales, Cornwall, and into Iberia, characterized by circular stone structures clustered within defensive enclosures, typically positioned on elevated ground with commanding views of the surrounding landscape. In the northwestern Iberian Peninsula, these settlements are known as castros, and Coaña is among the largest and best preserved examples in all of Asturias. The promontory itself does much of the defensive work. The ground falls away steeply on three sides, and on the fourth, the builders reinforced what nature had left incomplete: a series of ditches and ramparts cut into the earth, creating layered obstacles for anyone approaching overland. From within the settlement, the views extend across the river valley in multiple directions. Nothing moved through this part of the landscape without being seen. The people who built Coaña were part of a broader cultural tradition that archaeologists call the Castro culture, a pre-Roman Iron Age society that flourished across Galicia and Asturias roughly from the 8th or 9th century BCE onward. They were not a single unified people in any political sense. The Castros were largely autonomous communities, each controlling its own territory of farmland, pasture, and forest. But they shared architectural conventions, burial practices, and artistic traditions that suggest sustained contact and exchange across the region. At Coaña, excavations have revealed a dense interior filled with circular stone dwellings, storage structures, and what appear to be communal or workshop spaces. The houses are built to a consistent plan: round or oval walls of dry-fitted stone, a central hearth, a single doorway oriented away from the prevailing wind. They are small by modern standards, but they were not primitive. The craftsmanship evident in the stonework is deliberate and skilled, and the spatial organization of the settlement as a whole suggests a community with established social hierarchies and shared norms about how space was to be used. One of the more debated questions about Coaña concerns its peak population and the duration of its occupation. Based on the visible structures, some estimates have placed the community at several hundred inhabitants, possibly more during periods when the surrounding territory faced external pressure and people sought the safety of the promontory. The site was occupied across a remarkably long span, beginning in the Iron Age and continuing with modifications well into the Roman period. That continuity is itself significant. When Roman expansion reached this corner of the peninsula in the late 1st century BCE, it did not immediately erase what was already here. The process was more complicated than conquest and replacement. The Romans recognized the castros as the fundamental unit of local settlement and social organization, and for a time, they worked with that reality rather than against it. Coaña continued to be occupied under Roman administration, and archaeological evidence, coins, ceramics, fragments of Roman manufactured goods, shows genuine integration into Roman commercial and political networks. What changed gradually was the nature of the settlement itself. Roman influences can be read in the architecture. Some structures show rectangular room additions appended to older circular buildings, a physical record of changing tastes and perhaps changing status. Residents who had prospered within the new Roman economy may have wanted their homes to reflect that prosperity in ways that were intelligible to Roman visitors and administrators. This blending of traditions is one of the things that makes Coaña genuinely interesting to archaeologists. The site doesn't fit neatly into a story of indigenous culture obliterated by Roman conquest. Instead, it documents something messier and more human: the negotiation of identity under external pressure, the selective adoption of new forms while older ones persisted, the way communities adapt without entirely disappearing. The sauna-like structures discovered at Coaña have generated particular scholarly attention. These stone chambers, fed by heated rocks and associated with water, appear at several Asturian and Galician castros, and their function has been debated at length. Ritual purification, social ceremony, and simple bathing have all been proposed. The most widely discussed interpretation connects them to ceremonial practices tied to rites of passage, a hypothesis supported by their placement within the settlement and by comparable structures found elsewhere in Atlantic Europe. No firm consensus has been reached, but the structures themselves are among the most evocative reminders that the people of Coaña lived within a rich symbolic world that extended well beyond the practical demands of survival. The site was first systematically excavated in the 1940s, and work has continued at intervals since. Much of the promontory has now been cleared and stabilized, allowing visitors to walk between the stone foundations and read the layout of the community at something close to its original scale. Standing at the edge of the promontory, with the Navia River visible below and the hills of Asturias extending in every direction, it is not difficult to understand why people chose this place and why, for more than 1,000 years, they chose to stay. Astronomy is one of the oldest human impulses. Long before writing, long before cities, people were tracking the movement of the sun, the phases of the moon, the slow procession of stars across the seasonal sky. They did this not out of idle curiosity, but out of necessity. To know when to plant, when to expect the rains, when the year had turned and the cycle was beginning again. The sky was a calendar, a compass, and for many cultures, a direct line of communication with forces that governed human life. On the island of Crete, in the rugged uplands of the Lassithi Plateau region, a site known as Kokkino, named for the reddish hue of its soil, has drawn quiet but sustained attention from researchers interested in the astronomical knowledge of prehistoric Aegean cultures. The site is not famous in the way that Knossos is famous. It does not draw crowds, but among specialists in archaeoastronomy, it represents something worth taking seriously: potential physical evidence that Bronze Age Cretans were deliberately encoding celestial alignments into their built environment. The structures at Kokkino are modest in scale, stone arrangements and architectural remnants that taken in isolation might appear unremarkable. What elevates them as a subject of study is their orientation. Researchers examining the site have noted alignments that correspond to significant solar events, particularly the solstices and possibly certain lunar standstills. The question, as always with archaeoastronomical claims, is whether these alignments are deliberate or coincidental, a question that turns out to be considerably harder to answer than it might seem. Archaeoastronomy, as a discipline, has a complicated history. In its earlier decades, enthusiastic researchers sometimes saw intentional alignments everywhere, projecting sophisticated astronomical knowledge onto cultures that may simply have been building in practical response to landscape and climate. The field has since matured considerably, developing more rigorous statistical methods for distinguishing meaningful orientations from random ones. Applied to Kokkino, those methods have produced results that researchers describe as suggestive but not conclusive, a phrase that appears often in this kind of work and that reflects genuine intellectual honesty rather than evasion. The broader context matters here. Minoan civilization, which flourished on Crete roughly from 2700 to 1450 BCE, was a sophisticated Bronze Age culture with extensive trade networks, complex palatial administration, and a rich visual and religious tradition. The great palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea were not merely administrative centers. They were also ritual landscapes, and there is good evidence that solar orientation played a role in their design. The main hall at Knossos receives the rising sun on specific days of the year in ways that are difficult to attribute to chance. Phaistos is oriented toward the winter solstice sunrise with a precision that has impressed multiple independent researchers. Against that backdrop, the idea that Minoan communities might have established dedicated observational or ceremonial sites aligned to celestial events is not implausible. It fits a pattern visible across the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. The challenge with Kokkino specifically is the fragmentary state of the physical evidence. Unlike the palaces, which preserve enough architectural detail to support careful orientation analysis, the remains at Kokkino are partial, making it harder to reconstruct the original structure with the confidence needed to draw firm conclusions. Some researchers have proposed that sites like Kokkino functioned as rural sanctuaries, places outside the major palatial centers where agricultural communities could mark the turning points of the year through ceremony and observation. Minoan peak sanctuaries, established on prominent hilltops across the island, are well documented and clearly served ritual purposes. Whether Kokkino belongs to that tradition, represents something distinct, or reflects an overlap between astronomical observation and religious practice remains an open question. What the debate around Kokkino reveals, perhaps more than the site itself, is how much we still do not understand about the intellectual and spiritual life of Bronze Age Crete. The Minoans left no deciphered written records of their beliefs. Linear A, their administrative script, remains undeciphered to this day. Everything we know about Minoan religion and cosmology is inferred from art, architecture, and material culture. That leaves substantial room for uncertainty, and it means that sites like Kokkino carry interpretive weight that their physical remains alone might not seem to justify. There is also the question of continuity. Crete was occupied long before the Minoan palatial period, and the island's upland regions preserve traces of Neolithic and early Bronze Age activity that predate the Great Palaces by millennia. It is possible that Kokkino's significance predates the Minoan florescence. that it marks a place of long-standing ceremonial importance that was later incorporated into, or continued alongside, the more centralized ritual system of the palatial era. The plateau itself contributes to the sense of altitude and exposure that characterizes the site. At elevation, removed from the coastal settlements that dominated Minoan political life, the sky feels closer and more present. The horizon is clean. The stars, on a clear Cretan night, are extraordinary. Whether or not the stones at Kokkino were arranged with astronomical precision, it is not difficult to understand why someone, at some point, chose to stand here and look up. There are places where the scale of what ancient people built still has the power to stop you. Castro de San Cibrao de las is one of them. Spread across a broad hilltop in the province of Ourense in the Galicia region of northwestern Spain. This is not a village. It is something closer to a town, one of the largest Iron Age settlements ever documented in the entire Iberian Peninsula, and a site that forces a fundamental reassessment of what pre-Roman society in Atlantic Iberia was actually capable of. The numbers alone are striking. The enclosed area covers roughly 30 hectares. Within those boundaries, archaeologists have identified the remains of more than 2,000 stone structures. Dwellings, storage buildings, workshops, communal spaces arranged along what were once recognizable streets and pathways. The defensive perimeter consists of two concentric stone walls, massive in construction, reinforced at intervals, and equipped with controlled entry points. This was not a settlement that grew organically without plan. Someone, at some point, made deliberate decisions about how this place would be organized and what it would become. San Cibrao de las belongs to the same Castro culture tradition encountered at Coaña, but it operates at a fundamentally different scale. Where Coaña was a community, San Cibrao de las begins to look like a regional center, a place that may have served not just its own inhabitants, but a broader surrounding territory. The site's occupation spans roughly from the 2nd century BCE through the 1st or 2nd century CE, placing it squarely in the period of Roman engagement with northwestern Iberia. But the foundation and early development of the settlement appear to be indigenous, predating direct Roman administrative control. The question of what drove the creation of a settlement this large in this particular location has occupied researchers for decades. Several hypotheses have been proposed, and they are not mutually exclusive. One centers on defense. The decades before Roman consolidation of the Northwest were turbulent. Different Castro communities competed for resources and territory, and larger, better-defended settlements would have offered security that smaller hill forts could not. The double wall at San Cibrao de las is not a casual construction. It represents an enormous collective investment in protection. A second hypothesis emphasizes economic and political centralization. As Castro society became more complex in the later Iron Age, certain settlements may have emerged as nodes of exchange and administration, places where goods were aggregated, disputes were resolved, and social hierarchies were negotiated. The density and variety of structures at San Cibrao de las suggests a community differentiated by function in ways that smaller Castros were not. Certain areas of the site show evidence of metalworking and craft production at a scale that implies organized, specialized labor rather than household subsistence activity. A third interpretation, increasingly discussed in recent scholarship, positions San Cibrao de las as an example of what some researchers call an oppidum, a term borrowed from Caesar's descriptions of large Gaulish settlements applied cautiously to comparable sites in Iberia. The Oppidum model implies a settlement that functions as a proto-urban center, integrating multiple surrounding communities under a degree of shared political organization. Whether San Cibrao de las truly fits that model is contested, but the physical evidence of its scale and internal organization makes the comparison difficult to dismiss entirely. The street layout is one of the site's most compelling features. Unlike the more irregular arrangements found at smaller castros, San Cibrao de las shows evidence of planned circulation routes, pathways between structures that follow consistent orientations and suggest deliberate spatial design. This level of planning implies some form of coordinating authority, whether that authority resided in a council of elders, a dominant lineage, or a recognized chief, is something the material record cannot directly tell us. Excavations conducted over multiple campaigns since the mid-20th century have recovered a substantial corpus of finds: ceramics spanning the local and the imported, metal objects including weapons and personal ornaments, grinding stones, and agricultural tools, fragments of what appear to be ritual deposits. The ceramics are particularly informative. Local wares predominate, as expected, but Roman imports appear in contexts that suggest trade contact rather than conquest, goods arriving through exchange networks before the administrative machinery of Rome formally reached this region. That transitional moment, when a thriving indigenous settlement begins to absorb Roman material culture while maintaining its own social and architectural traditions, is visible in the archaeological record at San Cibrao de las in ways that closely parallel what was observed at Coaña. The pattern is consistent enough across multiple Galician and Asturian Castro sites to suggest a regional dynamic rather than isolated local responses. Roman influence percolated through existing networks before Roman power imposed itself directly. The site is known locally by another name, Cidade de San Cibrán, the city of San Cibrán, and that popular designation is telling. Generations of people in Ourense have looked at this hilltop and seen not a village, not a hamlet, but a city. They were not wrong to do so. The scale of what was built here, the density of its occupation, and the evidence of its internal organization all point towards something that deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than as a footnote to the Roman world that eventually absorbed it. Walking the site today, with the Galician hills rolling away in every direction, and the foundations of those 2,000 structures still visible beneath the turf and stone, it is possible to feel the weight of what this place once was, not in any mystical sense, but in the straightforward recognition that thousands of people built their lives here, generation after generation, and that they did so with intention and skill. The Peruvian coast is one of the driest places on Earth. The Humboldt Current, running cold along the shoreline, pulls moisture away from the land rather than delivering it, and the result is a narrow coastal strip of desert, interrupted occasionally by river valleys where Andean snowmelt reaches the Pacific, that receives almost no rainfall across vast stretches of the year. It is a landscape that seems to resist life, and yet it was precisely here, in these river valley oases running perpendicular to the coast, that some of the earliest complex societies in the Americas took shape thousands of years ago. Cerro Sechín sits in the Casma Valley, roughly 350 kilometers north of Lima, at the foot of a rocky hill that gives the site its name. The valley is one of those coastal oases, irrigated, fertile within its limits, flanked by desert on both sides. The site was first brought to serious archaeological attention in the 1930s by Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello, and what he found there was striking enough to generate debate that has continued with increasing sophistication ever since. The most immediately arresting feature of Cerro Sechín is its carved stone frieze. Arranged around the exterior of a rectangular platform mound, roughly 200 monolithic stone slabs bear carvings that rank among the most remarkable examples of pre-Columbian art anywhere in South America. The images are not abstract. They depict human figures, warriors, captives, dismembered bodies, rendered in a bold, direct style that leaves little ambiguity about the subject matter. Severed heads, stacked vertebrae, body parts arranged with an almost clinical precision, streams of blood represented as parallel incised lines running downward from wounds. The iconography is violent, and it has understandably dominated discussion of the site since Tello's initial excavations. But the meaning of that violence, what it was meant to communicate, and to whom, has been interpreted in several different ways. The most straightforward reading sees the frieze as a commemorative record of military victory, a monumental declaration of power carved into the most permanent medium available. Under this interpretation, Cerro Sechín functioned much like a triumphal monument in later traditions, a public statement that this community had prevailed over its enemies and that its leadership was capable of organized, effective violence. A second interpretation emphasizes ritual rather than historical commemoration. Many Andean cultures integrated sacrifice and ritual killing into their religious practices as mechanisms for maintaining cosmic order, ensuring agricultural fertility, propitiating supernatural forces, marking calendrical transitions. The carvings at Cerro Sechín under this reading would represent not a specific military event, but a recurring ceremonial reality, depicted in stone to make it permanent and to communicate the power of whoever controlled the ceremonies. A third line of argument, less widely accepted but still in circulation, has proposed that the figures represent a catastrophic epidemic or massacre rather than warfare, that the dismembered bodies are victims rather than trophies, and that the monument records disaster rather than triumph. Most specialists find this interpretation less persuasive than the military or ritual readings, but it reflects the genuine difficulty of decoding imagery without a written record to anchor interpretation. What most researchers today accept is some combination of the first two readings, that Cerro Sechín commemorates real military power while framing that power within a ritual and cosmological vocabulary. Violence and ceremony were not separate categories in early Andean thought. The display of military capacity was itself a ritual act, and the monument was designed to communicate on both registers simultaneously. The platform mound itself, behind the carved exterior, presents its own set of puzzles. Excavations have revealed that it was built in stages, with earlier structures buried beneath later construction phases, a pattern common across Andean monumental architecture, where the act of building over an existing sacred structure was understood to transfer and amplify its power rather than simply replace it. The earliest phases at Cerro Sechín may date to as far back as 1800 BCE or earlier, making the site one of the oldest monumental complexes yet identified on the Peruvian coast. The cultural affiliation of Cerro Sechín has been debated. The site belongs broadly to the late pre-ceramic and initial period of Andean prehistory, a formative era during which the basic template of Andean civilization was being established along the coast and in the adjacent highlands. Its relationship to other contemporary sites in the Casma Valley, including the much larger Sechín Alto complex nearby, is still being worked out. Some researchers have proposed that the Casma Valley as a whole was one of the most densely and ambitiously developed regions in early Andean South America, home to a polity of considerable scale and organizational complexity. That complexity is easy to overlook when attention focuses entirely on the carved friezes. The friezes are extraordinary, and they deserve the attention they receive. But the engineering of the mound itself, the logistics of quarrying, transporting, and precisely fitting those carved slabs, the labor organization required to build and rebuild the platform over multiple generations, represents an achievement no less impressive than the artistry of the carvings. Both dimensions of Cerro Sechín point toward the same conclusion, that the people of the Casma Valley, more than 3,000 years ago, were operating within a social system sophisticated enough to direct large-scale collective effort toward monumental ends. The carved warriors still stand along the base of the mound, worn by centuries of coastal weather, but still legible, still communicating something of the force and intention of the people who cut them. What exactly they are saying remains, in its details, a matter of scholarly conversation. But the general message, that power was here, that it was organized, that it demanded to be seen, comes through without difficulty. In 1987, a grave robber's tunnel changed the course of Andean archaeology. The site was Huaca Rajada, near the modern town of Sipan, in the Lambayeque Valley of northern Peru. And what emerged from beneath its eroded adobe mounds that year was a discovery of such richness and historical significance that it drew immediate comparisons to Tutankhamun's tomb. The comparison was not an exaggeration. What the Sipan royal tombs contained, and the story of how they came to light, remains one of the most important archaeological events of the 20th century. Huaca Rajada is not a single structure. It is a complex of large platform mounds built from millions of sun-dried adobe bricks, constructed by the Moche civilization over a period spanning roughly the 1st through 8th centuries CE. The Moche were one of the most sophisticated cultures of pre-Columbian South America, master metallurgists, skilled potters whose ceramic vessels documented their world with a naturalistic precision unmatched anywhere in the ancient Americas, and builders of monumental architecture that still dominates the landscape of the North Peruvian coast. Their society was hierarchical and regionally extensive, organized around ceremonial centers where elaborate ritual performances reinforced the authority of an elite class. The events of 1987 began when local huaqueros, the term used in Peru for looters of archaeological sites, a practice with deep roots in the region, began tunneling into one of the Huaca Rajada mounds and started pulling out extraordinarily fine gold and silver objects. Word spread quickly, as it always does when valuable material surfaces, and pieces began moving toward the antiquities market. Archaeologist Walter Alva, then director of the Bruning Museum in nearby Lambayeque, was alerted by police who had intercepted some of the objects. Alva moved fast. Working under difficult conditions, with the site still at risk from additional looting, his team began systematic excavation of the area the looters had penetrated. What they found beneath the surface transformed the understanding of Moche civilization. The first undisturbed tomb they reached contained the burial of a man of extraordinary status, a warrior priest, as Alva's team came to describe him, interred with a wealth of grave goods that had no parallel in any previously excavated Moche context. Gold and silver ornaments of astonishing craftsmanship, a spectacular peanut-shaped gold and silver necklace, ceremonial weapons, textiles, and ceramics, the remains of sacrificed individuals buried alongside the central figure, a banner of gilded copper that had once been displayed or carried in ceremonial processions. This individual became known as the Lord of Sipan, and his tomb was only the beginning. Subsequent excavations at Huaca Rajada revealed additional royal burials, including what appears to be an even older tomb, designated the Old Lord of Sipan, whose grave goods displayed technical sophistication in metalworking that pushed the timeline of Moche high craft production back further than previously recognized. The significance of these discoveries extended well beyond the material value of the objects themselves, extraordinary as that value was. For the first time, archaeologists had intact Moche royal burials with full contextual information. The precise position of every object, every accompanying individual, every offering. That context allowed researchers to read the burials as structured ritual texts rather than collections of isolated artifacts, and what those texts said was revelatory. The grave goods found with the Lord of Sipan closely matched the figures depicted in Moche ceramic art and on the famous Moche murals, particularly a scene that researchers call the sacrifice ceremony, which appears repeatedly across Moche visual culture and depicts elaborately costumed figures engaged in the ritual presentation of a goblet filled with the blood of sacrificed captives. The Lord of Sipan had been buried in the costume of one of the central figures in that ceremony. He was not merely a political ruler, he was a ritual performer, a man whose authority derived at least partly from his role in enacting the ceremonies that maintained Moche cosmological order. This insight that Moche rulers embodied specific ritual roles and were buried in the costumes of those roles reshaped scholarly understanding of how Moche political authority was structured and legitimized. It also raised questions about whether the sacrifice ceremony was purely symbolic or involved actual human sacrifice, questions that subsequent osteological analysis of skeletal remains from Moche sites has largely answered in favor of the latter interpretation. The Huaca Rajada site continues to be excavated, and new tombs have been discovered in recent decades, each adding detail to the picture of Moche royal practice. A tomb identified in 2007 contained the burial of a woman of elite status, the Lady of Chao, found at a different Moche site in the same region, which contributed to ongoing discussion about the role of women in Moche political and ceremonial life. The objects recovered from Sipan are now housed primarily in the Museo Tumba Reales de Sipan, a purpose-built museum in Lambayeque designed specifically to display and interpret the discoveries in their regional context. The museum itself has become one of the most visited archaeological destinations in Peru, drawing researchers and the public alike to engage with a civilization that until 1987 was known primarily through its art rather than through the physical remains of the people who made it. The mounds of Huaca Rajada still rise from the flat agricultural plain of the Lambayeque Valley, worn and irregular, giving little outward sign of what they contained. The tunnel the looters cut is long since stabilized and documented. What was almost lost to the antiquities trade instead became the foundation of an entirely new chapter in our understanding of who the Moche were. The Andes do not accommodate human ambition quietly. They present it with altitude, with cold, with terrain that shifts from tropical forest to glacial rock within a vertical distance that takes hours to climb. Any civilization that attempted to knit together the enormous geographic diversity of Western South America into a single political and economic system had to solve the Andes first. The Inca did exactly that, and the road network they built to accomplish it stands as one of the great engineering achievements of the pre-Columbian world. Paredones de Molleturo sits at roughly 3,400 meters above sea level in the western cordillera of the Andes in what is now the Azuay province of southern Ecuador. The name Paredones, meaning roughly Great Walls, gives some sense of what greets a visitor arriving at the site. The remains of substantial stone structures extend across a high plateau, commanding views of the surrounding mountain landscape, and positioned along one of the principal Inca roads connecting the Ecuadorian highlands to the coast. This was not a way station. It was an administrative and logistical hub, a node in the vast organizational system the Inca called Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters of the world. To understand Paredones de Molleturo, it helps to understand the Inca road system that gave it meaning. The Capac Ñan, or Royal Road, was not a single road but a network covering more than 30,000 kilometers across 6 modern South American countries, running from what is now southern Colombia to central Chile and Argentina. It traversed every environment the Andes could offer: high plateaus, deep river valleys, coastal deserts, cloud forests, and it was maintained by the state as a fundamental instrument of imperial control. Goods, armies, information, and imperial officials all moved along its routes. At regular intervals along the Capac Ñan, the Inca established tambos, way stations providing shelter, supplies, and administrative support for travelers moving on state business. But at more significant points in the network, larger installations served more complex functions. Paredones de Molleturo appears to have been one of these more substantial nodes, a place where the road from the coast met the highland network, where goods from dramatically different ecological zones were received, stored, and redistributed. The physical remains at the site reflect that complexity. Archaeologists have identified structures consistent with residential use, storage facilities, and what may have been spaces for administrative or ceremonial functions. The Inca built in a distinctive style: carefully fitted stone masonry, trapezoidal doorways, and niches, an aesthetic that managed to be simultaneously austere and precise. At Paredones, that style is recognizable in the surviving walls, even where the upper courses have collapsed and the structures have been reduced to their foundations. The storage function of Inca highland sites was not incidental. The entire Inca economic system was organized around the state's capacity to accumulate and redistribute resources, and storage was its physical infrastructure. Warehouses called kolkas were positioned throughout the empire, often at altitude where the cold temperatures acted as natural refrigeration for the freeze-dried and preserved foods that sustained armies, fed labor conscripts, and provided insurance against regional crop failures. Whether Paredones de Molleturo included formal kolka structures is a question that ongoing archaeological work continues to address. But the site's position and scale make some form of storage function highly plausible. The road itself, where it passes near Paredones, preserves sections that convey something of the original construction. Inca roads were engineered with care, paved where the terrain required it, drained to prevent erosion, marked with distance indicators, and in steep sections, fitted with stone steps that allowed sure-footed movement for human bearers and herds of llamas carrying loads. The Inca had no wheeled vehicles and no horses before European contact, so the entire transportation system was built around human and camelid capacity. This shaped the road's design in fundamental ways. Width calibrated to the passage of loaded llamas in single file. Grades managed to minimize exhaustion rather than to maximize speed. The Molleturo region specifically had strategic importance beyond its position on the road network. The western slopes of the Andes in this part of Ecuador are ecologically diverse. The altitude range between the highland plateau and the coastal lowlands encompasses multiple production zones, and the movement of goods between those zones was economically significant. Coastal products, including dried fish, salt, and certain luxury goods, moved upward into the highlands. Highland products, including textiles, freeze-dried potatoes, and manufactured goods, moved down toward the coast. Paredones de Molleturo sat at the point where those flows converged. The site also carries significance in the context of Inca expansion into Ecuador, which occurred relatively late in imperial history, roughly in the second half of the 15th century, under the rulers Tupac Inca Yupanqui and later Huayna Capac. The northern campaigns were among the most ambitious the Inca undertook, extending the empire into territories with their own established political traditions and requiring sustained military and administrative effort to consolidate. The infrastructure built during and after those campaigns, roads, tambos, administrative centers, represented the physical expression of imperial will imposed on a newly acquired frontier. Today, the site sits within a landscape that has changed substantially since Inca times. Agricultural use, road construction, and the slow reclamation of stone by local builders have all taken their toll. What remains is fragmentary but legible to a trained eye, and recent inclusion of the Capac Ñan as a UNESCO World Heritage Site has brought increased attention and resources to sites like Paredones de Molleturo that form part of its extended network. Standing on the plateau at Molleturo, with the mountains stacked in every direction and the wind moving steadily across the open ground, it is possible to feel the ambition of what the Inca attempted here. The audacious project of making these mountains serve an empire, of threading human organization through terrain that seemed designed to resist it. West Africa's history runs deeper than the world has often been willing to acknowledge. For generations, the dominant narrative of African prehistory undervalued or outright ignored the complexity of indigenous cultural development on the continent, preferring instead to attribute African achievements to outside influence or to treat sub-Saharan Africa as a region without significant history before European contact. The Nok culture and the extraordinary terracotta tradition it produced in the savanna woodlands of what is now central Nigeria stands as a direct and decisive refutation of that narrative. The Nok tradition takes its name from the village of Nok in Kaduna State, where the first recognized examples of its distinctive terracotta sculpture came to light in the 1940s during tin mining operations. A worker digging in alluvial deposits pulled up fragments of fired clay figures, unlike anything previously documented in the region. The finds reached the attention of Bernard Fagg, a British colonial officer with an interest in Nigerian antiquities, who recognized their significance and began systematic efforts to document and recover additional examples. What emerged over subsequent decades was the outline of a ceramic artistic tradition of remarkable sophistication, spread across a substantial geographic area in central Nigeria, and dated, through thermoluminescence and radiocarbon methods, to a period stretching from roughly 1500 BCE to 500 CE. That date range is worth pausing on. At its earliest, The Nok tradition was producing complex figurative sculpture during the same centuries that saw the height of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the fall of Troy, and the beginning of the Greek Dark Ages. The most developed phase of Nok terracotta production, concentrated roughly between 500 BCE and 200 CE, was contemporary with classical Greece, the Roman Republic, and the Maurya Empire of South Asia. The Nok sculptors were not working in isolation from the currents of the ancient world. They were part of it. The terracotta figures themselves are immediately striking. They range in size from small fragments to nearly life-sized heads, and they depict humans and animals with a stylistic vocabulary that is both internally consistent and visually arresting. Human figures typically show elongated heads, sometimes dramatically so, with carefully rendered facial features, pierced or triangular eyes, open or pursed mouths, detailed hairstyles, and ornaments that vary considerably from figure to figure. The bodies, where preserved, show evidence of elaborate clothing, jewelry, and body modification. Many figures appear to be seated or in postures of some ceremonial significance. The pierced eyes are one of the most discussed technical features of Nok sculpture. Researchers have proposed that the perforations served a functional purpose during the firing process, allowing gases to escape from the clay interior and reducing the risk of cracking. But the consistency and deliberateness with which the feature was applied across so many figures suggests it also carried aesthetic or symbolic weight. It became a defining characteristic of the style, a convention that identified a work as belonging to the Nok tradition in much the same way that proportional conventions identified Attic Greek sculpture. What the figures represented, and what social or religious function they served, remains one of the central unresolved questions in the study of the Nok culture. Several interpretations have been proposed. Some researchers have connected the terracottas to ancestor veneration, a practice widespread across sub-Saharan Africa in which sculpted figures serve as intermediaries between the living and the dead. Others have suggested a connection to healing rituals, pointing to the evidence of physical abnormalities and disease symptoms depicted on some figures. A third line of interpretation emphasizes the figure's association with elite status and ceremonial life, noting that the skill and resources required to produce them suggest specialized craft production rather than household activity. The most widely discussed aspect of Nok beyond its sculpture is its relationship to iron technology. The Nok culture appears to have been among the earliest producers of iron in sub-Saharan Africa, with smelting evidence from some sites dating to as early as the 5th or 6th century BCE. The co-occurrence of sophisticated terracotta production and early iron metallurgy at Nok sites is significant and has led some researchers to propose that both technologies emerged within a single complex society capable of organizing specialized production across multiple craft traditions. Others are more cautious, noting that the geographic distribution of Nok-associated sites is large enough that different communities within the tradition may have been responsible for different aspects of its technological profile. The question of how Nok society was organized, whether it constituted a single political entity, a culturally related group of independent communities, or something between those extremes, cannot currently be resolved from the available evidence. No Nok settlement has been comprehensively excavated. Most known examples of Nok terracotta have come from secondary contexts: alluvial deposits, eroded hillsides, the disturbed earth of mining operations, rather than from undisturbed occupation sites where spatial relationships between objects could illuminate social organization. This is a significant limitation, and it means that almost everything known about the Nok culture is inferred from the objects themselves rather than from the contexts in which they were used. That inferential challenge has not diminished the importance of what the Nok tradition represents. It documents a sub-Saharan African society that more than 2,000 years ago was producing art of genuine complexity and beauty, working iron with technical competence, and participating in whatever regional networks of exchange and influence connected the communities of the West African savanna. The figures recovered from Nigerian soil carry a quiet authority that requires no external validation. They speak for themselves. Rome had a way of arriving somewhere and making it look as though it had always been there. The forums, the colonnaded streets, the triumphal arches and bathhouses, and carefully laid mosaics. Wherever the empire extended itself, these things followed, reshaping the landscape according to a template that was simultaneously practical and ideological. The message was consistent. This is what civilization looks like, and you are now part of it. Volubilis, at the foot of the Zerhoun Massif, in what is now northern Morocco, received that message in full. What makes it remarkable is how completely and how long it was absorbed. The site sits on a fertile plain, roughly 30 kilometers north of the modern city of Meknes, at the far western edge of the Roman province of Mauritania Tingitana. It was not a frontier outpost in the sense of a military installation pushed into hostile territory. By the time Rome formally annexed the region in 40 CE, following the death of the client King Ptolemy of Mauritania, Volubilis was already a substantial settlement with its own established urban character. The Romans did not found this city. They inherited it, and then they rebuilt it in their own image. The pre-Roman layers at Volubilis reveal a settlement with Berber and Phoenician antecedents, part of the broader network of coastal and near-coastal communities that Carthaginian influence had shaped across North Africa before Rome's destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE. The transition from Carthaginian to Roman cultural orbit was gradual rather than abrupt, mediated by the Mauritanian kingdom that served as a buffer between direct Roman administration and the indigenous populations of the Western Maghreb. By the time formal annexation came, local elites had already been engaging with Roman material culture for generations. Under Roman administration, Volubilis flourished. The evidence of that flourishing is extraordinarily well preserved, partly because the city was never built over by later urban development on the same scale as sites closer to the Mediterranean heartland, and partly because a significant earthquake in 1755, the same Lisbon earthquake that devastated Portugal, caused collapses that effectively sealed and protected much of what lay beneath. The result is a Roman city where the skeleton of urban life is still legible in remarkable detail. The Forum complex, the Capitol Temple, the basilica used for legal and commercial proceedings, these public structures formed the civic center of Volubilis and communicated Roman urban values with unmistakable clarity. The triumphal arch of Caracalla, erected in 217 CE to honor the emperor who had extended Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, still stands at the entrance to the main colonnaded street, worn but largely intact. Walking the Decumanus Maximus, the main east-west thoroughfare, between the stumps of its columns, with olive groves visible beyond the site boundaries, and the Zerhoun Hills rising behind, produces a disorienting compression of time that few archaeological sites can match. The private houses of Volubilis are in some ways more revealing than the public monuments. Excavation has uncovered dozens of substantial residences belonging to the city's elite, and many of them preserve their floor mosaics in good condition. These mosaics are among the finest Roman examples found anywhere in North Africa. Elaborate mythological scenes, depictions of wild animal hunts, portraits of Orpheus charming beasts with his music, geometric borders of extraordinary precision. They document not just wealth, but cultural aspiration, the desire of Volubilis's prosperous residents to participate fully in the visual and intellectual culture of the broader Roman world. The House of Orpheus, the House of the Labors of Hercules, the Gordian Palace, these residences took their modern names from the mythological subjects of their mosaics. The families who commissioned them were demonstrating in the most durable medium available that they were conversant with the canonical stories of classical civilization. Whether those families were of Berber, Phoenician, Italian, or mixed descent, and Volubilis's population was certainly diverse, they had made a cultural choice that expressed itself in Roman artistic vocabulary. What happened to Volubilis after Rome is equally instructive. The Western Roman Empire's administrative reach contracted in the late 3rd century CE, and Volubilis was effectively abandoned by Roman imperial authority around 285 CE, earlier than most of the empire's western provinces. Yet the city did not empty. A substantial population remained, and the community that persisted was neither purely Roman nor a simple reversion to pre-Roman indigenous culture. Latin remained in use for several more centuries, as evidenced by inscriptions dated well after official Roman withdrawal. The urban infrastructure continued to function, maintained by a community that had internalized Roman urban life deeply enough to sustain it without Roman institutional support. Arabic-speaking populations arrived with the Islamic expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries, and Volubilis, known in Arabic as Walili, became part of a new political and cultural landscape. The Idrisid dynasty, which established the first Arab-Islamic kingdom in Morocco, made the site its initial base in the late 8th century before founding nearby Fes. The city was occupied and modified, its stones occasionally quarried for new construction elsewhere, its mosaics protected by accumulated debris. By the medieval period, it had been largely abandoned, and the ruins that remain today reflect the accumulated layering of all those occupations and departures. UNESCO designated Volubilis a World Heritage Site in 1997, recognizing what researchers had long understood, that this particular intersection of Berber, Phoenician, Roman, and early Islamic history in a single, well-preserved urban landscape is genuinely without parallel. The mosaics still catch the afternoon light. The Arch of Caracalla still frames the distant hills, and the olive trees that grow beyond the site boundaries are descended, in all likelihood, from the orchards that fed this city when it was alive. This documentary has traveled an extraordinary distance, from the mountain ridges of Liguria to the deserts of Peru, from the savannas of Nigeria to the fertile plains of Morocco. 16 sites, dozens of civilizations, thousands of years of human ambition recorded in stone, clay, brick, and carved reliefs. What connects them is not geography or chronology. It is something more fundamental: the persistent human drive to build, to organize, to make meaning from the landscape, and to leave behind some evidence that a community existed and mattered. The Castro culture families of Asturias, the Moche lords buried in golden regalia, the Nok sculptors working fired clay into faces of haunting precision. None of them knew each other, but they were all engaged in the same essential project: History is not the story of a few famous empires radiating civilization outward to passive recipients. It is something far richer and more complicated. A world full of peoples who developed their own solutions, their own art, their own ways of organizing power and marking time. These 16 sites are reminders of that richness, and there are thousands more still waiting to be properly understood. If this documentary gave you something, a new name to look up, a place you had never heard of, a question you hadn't thought to ask before, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. We are a small channel with an ambitious vision, and every single subscriber genuinely matters to us. If you found value in this journey, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support is what makes the next documentary possible. Thank you for watching. The past has no shortage of stories left to tell.